Hey guys, tonight we are wrapping ourselves in the rough, probably quite scratchy. Woolen habit of a Benedictine monk in 10th century France. Picture this, it's an hour or two after midnight. The kind of profound, inky blackness that city dwellers rarely experience. It's utterly dark, stone cold even in the height of summer. And a bell, a great, resonant bronze bell, is clanging with a stern, unyielding determination that suggests snoozing, or indeed any form of negotiation, is definitely not an option on the divine agenda. You're not reaching for your smartphone to blearily check the time or scroll through your notifications. You're fumbling with stiff, chilled fingers for your simple leather sandals on a freezing, unforgiving stone floor. Your breath mitts in the frigid air of the dormitory, and you're preparing to shuffle, along with your equally sleepy brethren, to the unheated chapel for several hours of chanting and prayer. Sounds wonderfully cozy. Right. Honestly, if you were suddenly transported there with your modern sensibilities, your deep-seated appreciation for central heating, and your desperate, non-negotiable need for at least 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, followed by a warm, comforting latte, you probably wouldn't survive the first week, let alone the relentless chill. The truly heroic levels of early rising, and a diet that likely didn't feature much in the way of avocado toast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always wonderful to know who's drifting off with us around the world. In fact, why not drop your location and local time in the comments below? It's fascinating to see our global congregation of sleepy history buffs tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sound of that bell, the signum as it's called, still echoes in the bone-deep cold of the vast, cavernous dormitory. It's not a gentle, melodic chime. It's a summons, a call to the Opus Dei, the work of God, which forms the very spine of your existence here. You sit up on your straw-filled pallet, excellent for fostering humility and, one imagines, pretty good for encouraging you to get up quickly, less so for actual, deep, restorative comfort. Your single rough woolen blanket, which felt surprisingly warm a few moments ago in the depths of sleep, now seems like a flimsy defense against the pervasive chill that seeps from the thick stone walls of this 10th century French monastery. Around you, in the Stygian gloom, you hear the rustles and sighs of your brothers, other shadowy figures slowly emerging from their own brief encounters with oblivion, each one performing the same practiced, fumbling movements in the dark. There are no bedside lamps, no gentle wake-up lights here. The monastic alarm clock was usually a very dedicated, and probably quite unpopular, fellow monk whose job it was to ring that bell with gusto, ensuring no one missed the first call to prayer, considerably less negotiable than hitting the snooze button on your phone 9 times. Your getting ready routine is admirably brief. There's no mirror time, no complex skincare regimen, no agonizing over what to wear, your habit. A simple tunic, scapular, and cowl is your all occasions ensemble. You pull it on over your undergarments, the coarse wool of familiar. Slightly abrasive, yet strangely comforting presence against your skin. Perhaps you quickly splash icy water on your face from a communal basin, a jolt that certainly helps dispel any lingering cobwebs of sleep. The air itself smells ancient, of cold stone, damp earth, old wood, the lingering, faint scent of beeswax from last evening's candles, and perhaps a ghostly trace of incense from the chapel. These are the subtle, unchanging perfumes of your enclosed world. Everything you do, from the moment you wake until you finally return to your pallet many, many hours later, is governed by a single, extraordinary document, the Rule of Saint Benedict. This is the absolute bedrock of your life, the divinely inspired instruction manual for monastic living. It's a truly significant mainstream historical fact that the Rule of Saint Benedict, meticulously written by Benedict of Nursia in the early 6th century, became the foundational and most influential text for organizing and guiding monastic communities throughout Western Europe for centuries. Outlining a remarkably balanced life of communal prayer, the Opus Dei, manual labor labora, sacred reading, lectio divina, and unwavering obedience to the abbot and the rule itself. It's a blueprint for a community dedicated to seeking God, emphasizing humility, stability, and a structured rhythm of devotion and work. It's not just a book of regulations, it's a way of life, a path to spiritual perfection, or at least a very concerted effort in that direction. And the community took its observance very seriously. For a rather interesting and slightly intimidating, quirky tidbit in many medieval Benedictine monasteries, there was a designated monk, often known as the circuiter or sometimes the night watchman, whose specific duty included silently patrolling the dormitory during the night and the choir stalls in the church during the long night offices. His job was to ensure that no brother had succumbed to the overwhelming temptation of sleep, and he would often carry a hooded lantern, its dim light just enough to spot any dozing figures, whom he might gently, or perhaps not so gently, prod back to wakefulness and their sacred duties. Imagine the sudden, unwelcome nudge in the ribs if your weary head had slumped forward during the third nocturne of vigils. It certainly added a frisson of vigilance to the proceedings. The very idea of choosing this life, this relentless cycle of prayer, work, and privation in 10th century Francia, is something that sparks thought. Historians still argue whether the intense asceticism and the demanding, highly structured schedule of early medieval Benedictine monastic life primarily attracted individuals seeking genuine spiritual transcendence and a deep, personal connection with the divine, or whether it also, perhaps more pragmatically, served as a structured, relatively safe, and ordered refuge for those seeking an escape from the often brutal, chaotic, and dangerously unpredictable secular world of the time. With its famines, plagues, and endless petty warfare, it was certainly a commitment, and not one entered into lightly. So, here you are, brother scribe-to-be, or perhaps brother turnip-whore extraordinaire. It's 2 in the morning. The bell has rung its imperative summons. The cold is seeping into your bones. And your day. A long, meticulously scheduled, and almost entirely predictable sequence of duties and devotions has just irrevocably begun. There's no turning back, no calling in sick, no option for a mental health day. There is only the rule, the bell, and the path to the choir. We're the first of many. Many psalms awaits your sleepy, yet dutiful voice. And so, that sleepy yet dutiful voice you've just summoned, along with perhaps 30, 40, or even more similarly drowsy voices, now joins the soft, almost ghostly, procession shuffling out of the vast, chilled dormitory. You become part of a silent river of dark-robed figures, flowing slowly and with practiced familiarity through even darker, stone-flagged corridors. The only sounds are the almost imperceptible padding of your worn leather sandals on the cold, uneven flags, and perhaps the occasional, quickly stifled cough that echoes unnervingly in the profound stillness. You're heading, as you do every single night of your life here, to the spiritual heart of the monastery, the unheated, cavernous church, for the first great spiritual bastion of the day, the long, deeply solemn, and let's be perfectly honest between us, sometimes profoundly, heroically sleep-inducing office of vigils, also known then as matins or the nocturnes, the stars, if you were able to step outside and glance upwards, would still be brilliant and hard in a sky that has many long hours to go before it even begins to consider thinking about the possibility of dawn. You file into the choir, your designated stall a familiar, if not exactly welcoming, presence in the gloom. The church is a vast echo chamber of cold stone and even colder shadows, the air thick with the memory of yesterday's incense and the faint, waxy scent of countless extinguished candles. What little light there is comes perhaps from a single, flickering oil lamp near the abbot's stall, or a few carefully shielded candles at the main lectern where the readings will take place. It's just enough to prevent you from bumping into your brethren too, obviously, but certainly not enough to encourage any kind of bright-eyed alertness. The perks of attending vigils are, shall we say, subtle prime, uncushioned seating on a cold, hard wooden bench, and unmatched, if somewhat obscured, a view of the back of Brother Cuthbert's cowl in the stall in front of you, and the slow cultivation of a deep, almost spiritual, appreciation for the eventual invention of coffee. Several long centuries too late for your immediate comfort. This is the mainstream historical fact of the office of vigils, or Matins. It was traditionally the longest, the earliest, and arguably the most penitential of all the canonical hours prescribed by the rule of Saint Benedict. It was meticulously structured, often divided into 2 or 3 sections called nocturnes, and was celebrated in the very depth of the night, usually starting around 2 a.m. Its purpose was manifold: to keep a spiritual watch while the rest of the world slept, to meditate on mortality and salvation, to battle the temptations that darkness might bring, and, fundamentally, to offer continuous praise to God. It was an act of devotion, of discipline, and, for many a monk struggling against the primal urge to simply curl up and go back to sleep, an act of sheer, unadulterated willpower. The core of vigils is the chanting of the Psalms. Tonight, like most nights, you will work your way through a significant number of them, your voice joining the collective, somewhat gravelly, pre-dawn drone of your brothers. The melodies are ancient, hypnotic, rising and falling in the familiar patterns of Gregorian chant. Musicologists and liturgical historians, by the way, continue to debate the precise nature of the exact chant melodies, the specific rhythmic interpretations, and the unwritten performance practices that were used for these psalms and their accompanying responses during the 10th century. Musical notation was still in a relatively early and evolving state then, meaning that much of the musical tradition was reliant on painstaking oral transmission, memory, and, no doubt, subtle regional variations that developed within the Benedictine order across different monasteries. So, what you're chanting might sound subtly different from what your Benedictine cousins over in, say, Cluny might be intoning. Between the blocks of psalms come the readings, long, often very long, passages. These are drawn from the Holy Scriptures, perhaps from the prophets, or the epistles, or the Gospels. They are also taken from the writings of the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory the Great, their complex theological arguments and dense prose echoing through the shadowy vastness of the Church. Sometimes, especially on saints' feast days, you'll hear readings from the Acts of the Saints, recounting tales of heroic virtue, martyrdom, and miraculous interventions. It's like listening to a particularly lengthy and deeply serious podcast series, one that you accidentally set to play all night. Every night, with the added challenge of it being in Latin, by candlelight, and with the ever-present threat of the circuiter's gentle or not-so-gentle prod if your attention, or your head, should begin to wander too far south. And that light, for a truly evocative, quirky tidbit to read the large, heavy, handwritten antiphonaries and lectionaries which contain the text for the office, especially in the almost total darkness of the choir during vigils. Monks often had to rely on the most minimal of candlelight. This might be from a single, precious oil lamp carefully positioned near the main lectern, or perhaps from thick tallow candles held by designated younger monks or novices, whose job it was to try and illuminate the massive, hand-lettered script for the reader or the cantor. Deciphering the complex ligatures and abbreviations of medieval script under such faint, flickering, and often unreliable illumination, especially when one was profoundly sleepy and shivering with cold, was a significant recurring challenge. Unsurprising, then, that mistakes in chanting or reading were not entirely uncommon. though they were probably met with a swift corrective and deeply unimpressed glance from the cantor or the abbot. You stand, you sit, you bow, all according to the ancient, prescribed ritual. The cold seeps into your bones through the rough wool of your habit and the thin soles of your sandals. Your stomach might be gently rumbling, a faint protest from the very meager supper you had many hours ago, now feeling like a distant, almost forgotten memory. My kingdom. You might silently, and somewhat impiously, muse. For a single, stale crust of bread right now, and perhaps a slightly, just slightly, shorter canticle for this third nocturne. But you push the thought away. This is the work of God. This is your sacred duty. You focus on the words, on the rise and fall of the chant, on the collective breath of your community, a small island of prayer in a vast, sleeping world. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. As the final psalms are sung and the last lengthy readings conclude, you might sense a subtle shift, not yet light, not by any means, but perhaps the deepest. Densest part of the night feels like it's just beginning to loosen its grip. The office of vigils, the long night watch, is drawing to its close. Your knees are stiff, your throat is dry, and the allure of that straw palate, however lumpy, is almost overwhelming. But the day, or rather the night's first major spiritual hurdle, is nearly done. Soon. There will be a brief pause, a moment of profound stillness before the monastery stirs again for the next call to prayer. The beautiful office of lauds, which will greet the very first, faint promise of the approaching dawn, the last echoes of the final. Solemn antiphon from the lengthy office of vigils fade into the deep. Resonant silence of the ancient stone church. There's a collective, almost imperceptible sigh that seems to ripple through your assembled brethren. Not a sigh of relief. Exactly. For the Opus Dei, the work of God, is a profound joy. Of course, a very specific, very early morning, rather chilly kind of joy, but perhaps it's a sigh of momentary human weariness acknowledged, accepted, and then dutifully released into the vastness. You remain in your wooden stall, a dark, still figure cloaked in your rough wool habit, one in a sea of similarly dark. Still figures. The air in the church is bitingly cold, the kind of penetrating cold that seems to settle deep in your bones and makes your teeth ache just a little. And the profound, almost tangible darkness of the pre-dawn still presses in from every corner, thick and heavy like a velvet curtain. But now, something is subtly, almost imperceptibly, different. There's a new anticipation in the air, a quiet, internal turning of the collective soul towards the east, towards the unseen horizon, towards the beautiful, uplifting office of lauds, which will indeed greet that very first. Faint and always deeply welcome promise of the approaching dawn. There might be a brief period of profound stillness now, a sacred pause. Some of your brothers might bow their heads in private prayer, their lips moving silently. Others might simply sit, eyes closed, in a state of quiet recollection, letting the weight of the night's long vigil settle and dissipate. You can hear the faint, rhythmic drip of condensation from the vaulted stone ceiling high above. A tiny, persistent sound in the overwhelming silence. There are no clocks ticking here, no digital displays to announce the precise minute. The knowledge of when to begin lauds is more ancient, more attuned to the earth's own rhythm. It's a quirky and fascinating tidbit that monks in the 10th century wouldn't have possessed precise mechanical clocks to determine the exact moment of dawn for the office of lauds. They would have relied entirely on natural, time-honored signs, perhaps the predictable, almost liturgical. Crowing of the monastery's designated alpha rooster, you can almost hear him now. Old Gregory Peck clearing his throat for his big solo, or the subtle, almost unnoticeable changes in light intensity perceived through a high eastern window by experienced, watchful eyes, or even a designated elderly monk whose rheumatism always flared up exactly 45 minutes before actual sunrise, acting as a kind of human barometer. Then, a subtle shift, perhaps a senior monk, the cantor, clears his throat, a single, clear note might be intoned, and the office of lauds begins. The name lauds itself comes from the Latin word for praise, and this entire office is an outpouring of joyful, grateful praise to God, especially for the gift of creation and the dawning of a new day. It's a significant mainstream historical fact that lauds, often referred to as morning prayer, is one of the most ancient, pivotal, and spiritually significant of the canonical hours within the Benedictine liturgical tradition. Always celebrated at sunrise or first light, it is uniquely characterized by its joyful, uplifting tone and, most notably, its invariable inclusion of Psalms 148, 149, and 150, the great laudate psalms, which passionately call upon all of creation, from the angels in heaven to the creatures of the sea and the very stars themselves, to praise the Lord. And so, your voice, still a little rough from the cold and the earlier chanting of vigils, joins with those of your brothers to send these psalms of universal praise soaring up into the shadowy arches of the church. Laudate Dominum de Caelus, you chant. Praise ye the Lord from the heavens. The energy in the choir feels different now from the deep solemnity of vigils. There's a lifting, an opening, a sense of hope and renewal, even if your fingers are still numb and you're fairly certain a small, particularly hardy family of frost sprites has taken up residence in your left sandal. The shift in mood is almost palpable, a bit like that feeling when you finally get your first sip of hot coffee after a very long, very dark night. A sense of optimism begins to tentatively return to the world. Following the laudate psalms, there's usually an Old Testament canticle, perhaps the song of the three young men in the fiery furnace. Another powerful hymn of praise in the face of adversity. Then comes one of the absolute highlights of lauds, the Benedictus, the canticle of Zechariah from the Gospel of Luke. Beginning Benedictus Dominus Deus Israel. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel. This beautiful prophetic canticle speaks of salvation, mercy, and the dawning light that guides our feet into the way of peace. As you chant, it's familiar. Comforting words, you might see, if you're positioned just right, the very faintest. Palest gray beginning to seep through the thick glass of the easternmost window, a visual echo of the canticle's promise of light. The structure of lauds, like all the offices, is precise psalms, antiphons. A short chapter, a brief reading from Scripture, a hymn appropriate to the morning, a versicle and response, and then the collect or concluding prayer. For the day, even though the words are repeated daily, or in a weekly cycle, you strive to find new meaning, new connection in them each time. Though, admittedly, some mornings, especially when Brother Thomas is attempting a particularly enthusiastic descant on Psalm 150, hitting notes previously unknown to either man or angel, your primary focus might be on maintaining a serenely pious expression. The angels are probably wincing, but very, very politely, of course. Liturgical scholars and dedicated musicologists, by the way, sometimes engage in lively discussions concerning the subtle yet significant variations in how exactly the triumphant and climactic laudate psalms, Psalms 148 to 150, were musically rendered during the office of lauds in different 10th century monastic centers across Francia and beyond, while the core Gregorian chant forms were. Of course, widespread and foundational, there's ongoing academic inquiry into regional melodic inflections, the possible use of unwritten, traditional ornamental notes, or the specific emotional character and devotional intensity imbued in their performance, which could range from expressions of profound, solemn awe to more overtly exuberant and celebratory outpourings of spiritual joy. As Lauds draws to its close, the light outside, though still very early, is now undeniably present. The world beyond the monastery walls is beginning to stir. You might hear the distant, first tentative chirping of birds. The long night is finally over. A sense of quiet accomplishment, of a significant spiritual duty fulfilled, settles over the community. You've praised God through the darkness, and now you've greeted his light. The office of Lauds concludes. And with it, the first phase of your monastic day. Soon, you will move on to prime, and then to the practicalities of the chapter meeting and the assignment of your daily labor. But for this brief moment, there is just the lingering resonance of the final Amen and the nascent promise of the sun. Slowly, patiently, beginning its ascent, that nascent promise of the sun, which you and your brothers greeted with a joyful, cascading psalms of lauds, is now beginning to truly fulfill itself as you file out of the main choir of the church, perhaps blinking a little as the early morning light, though still pale and decidedly thin, filters through the high clerestory windows. It feels almost shockingly bright after the profound pre-dawn gloom you've inhabited for so many hours. There's a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the monastery's rhythm. The long night vigil, the spiritual battle fought against darkness and drowsiness, is well and truly over. The day, with all its potential for further prayer, for dedicated work, and perhaps, if you're assigned to hoeing a particularly stubborn patch of turnips in the West Field again, for just a little bit of existential, back-aching ennui, is officially dawning. And to mark this important transition, to sanctify its very beginning, and to arm yourselves spiritually for the hours ahead, comes the next unwavering call in the meticulously structured daily timetable, the office of prime. You might move now, not necessarily back to the dormitory, but perhaps to a smaller side chapel. Or you might remain in the choir stalls, depending on the custom of your particular 10th century French Benedictine house. The air is still cold, a damp chill clinging to the ancient stone. But now it's mingled with the faintest, almost indefinable, scent of the waking world outside, perhaps a hint of wood smoke as the kitchen fires are being coaxed to life. Or the clean, sharp smell of dew on grass if a door has been briefly opened. The main focus of this office, a key mainstream historical fact, is that prime. Traditionally recited around the first hour of daylight, which in a pre-clock era meant roughly 6 a.m. Depending on the season, was one of the little hours of the divine office. It served the crucial purpose of sanctifying the very beginning of the day's active work, and often included specific prayers seeking divine guidance, strength, and protection from sin throughout the labors that lay ahead, as well as, quite distinctively, the reading of the martyrology. It's like a spiritual briefing, a huddle with the Almighty before the day's game truly kicks off. The office itself is shorter, more compact than the marathon of vigils or the expansive praise of lauds, but it has its own distinct character. It typically begins with a hymn, perhaps one that speaks of creation, of light dispelling darkness, or of the virtues needed for a day well spent in God's service. Your voice, now hopefully a little less gravelly after the exertions of lauds, joins the familiar, steady chant, then come the psalms, usually 3 of them, often including, over the course of the week, significant portions of the very long Psalm 118 or 119 in some numberings, with its recurring themes of devotion to God's law and guidance. These are followed by the capitulum, or little chapter, a very short, pithy reading from Scripture, and then a short responsory, a call and response verse that reinforces the theme. It's all very structured, very predictable, the predictability itself being a kind of comfort, a framework upon which the day is built. You wouldn't want any sudden liturgical surprises at this hour. It's far too early for ad-libbing the divine. one of the most unique and for our sleepy purposes. Rather interesting parts of Prime is the reading of the Martyrology. This is essentially this day in saintly history, a designated reader, perhaps a monk with a particularly clear and resonant voice and good eyesight for the often crabbed script, will solemnly announce the saints whose feast days are commemorated on this particular calendar day. And for a rather bracing, quirky tidbit, a distinctive feature of Prime in many monastic traditions was precisely this reading of the Martyrology, which could sometimes include surprisingly brief, almost stark, and occasionally rather gory, details of the various saints' martyrdoms. You might hear of Saint Agatha having her breasts sheared off, or Saint Lawrence being roasted on a gridiron, or Saint Sebastian looking like a particularly unhappy pincushion. It served as a rather vivid and arguably somewhat jarring reminder of the ultimate sacrifices made for the faith, a sort of spiritual espresso shot to jolt you into pious gratitude before you began your own, hopefully significantly less perilous. Daily labors in the turnip patch or the scriptorium. It was the original gossip column of saints, and if you will. Or perhaps today's excruciating edition of Who Got Gruesomely Martyred This Day in History? Certainly put your own minor aches and pains into perspective. Following the Martyrology. There are more prayers the Kyrie Ellison, the Pater Noster, Our Father, perhaps the Credo Creed depending on the day and local custom, and then come the specific collects and prayers for the day's work, asking for God's blessing on your labors, for strength to perform them well, for protection from temptation like the temptation to take a nap in the sun-warmed hayloft instead of weeding the herb garden, and for the grace to offer all your actions, however mundane, to the glory of God. It's like a medieval monk's prayer for avoiding the 10th century equivalent of internet rabbit holes or particularly tedious office politics during his working hours. The exact selection of psalms or the emphasis of certain prayers within the office of Prime could vary. Of course, liturgists and historians of monasticism sometimes explore the subtle shifts in emphasis and the particular selection of psalms or devotional prayers within the office of Prime across different Benedictine congregations and various historical periods. They debate whether these nuanced variations reflected evolving theological understandings of the first hour of the day or were perhaps more practical adaptations made to align with the monastery's specific work schedule. Local saints cults, or prevailing environmental conditions. Did a monastery in a particularly swampy, ag-ridden area, for example, include a more fervent prayer for physical health at Prime than one perched on a breezy, sun-drenched hilltop? Perhaps, as Prime concludes with a final blessing, often given by the abbot or the presiding monk, you feel a sense of preparedness. The night offices are done. The new day has been officially greeted and consecrated. You are spiritually armed, as it were, ready to face whatever tasks await. The sun is now properly climbing the sky, casting longer, more defined shadows, and the sounds of the monastery fully awakening are more apparent. The distant clatter from the kitchen, the lowing of cattle from the byre, perhaps the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer from the forge if your monastery is large enough to have one. The action-packed part of your day is about to begin. Right. 6 or so hours of prayer successfully navigated. Now for the real excitement turnip patroller, perhaps. If you're lucky. A thrilling session of copying out a particularly dense theological treatise in a chilly, poorly lit scriptorium. The possibilities within the rule are, if not endless, then at least consistently scheduled. Those consistently scheduled possibilities, which your now thoroughly prayed for and spiritually fortified self is theoretically ready to embrace with humble obedience, and perhaps just a tiny, lingering longing for that straw pallet, begin to take concrete, practical shape not long after the final. Resounding Amen of the office of Prime has faded into the cool, still morning air. There's a collective rustle of rough woolen habits, a soft rhythmic scraping of leather sandals on ancient stone, as you and your Benedictine brothers file out, perhaps from the side chapel where Prime was recited, or from your familiar stalls in the main choir. With practiced, solemn steps, you make your way, usually in a silent, orderly procession, towards another key architectural and spiritual hub of this self-contained monastic universe, the chapter house. Here, before the diverse physical labors of the day truly commence, the entire professed community gathers for its daily dose of spiritual instruction, communal recalibration, often some rather public truth-telling, and, yes, the all-important assignment of orderly duties and decidedly unglamorous chores. There's no time for a leisurely second cup of non-existent coffee and a quick scroll through the medieval equivalent of social media. It's straight into the morning meeting, 10th century Francia style. And punctuality is, as you can imagine, highly encouraged. The chapter house itself is often an impressive, dedicated space, usually located off the eastern walk of the cloister, close to the church. You enter, and the air feels cool, perhaps a little damp, imbued with the faint, scholarly scent of old parchment from the books kept there and the ancient, slightly musty aroma of the stone itself. Light might filter in through arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. The monks take their places, typically seated on stone benches running along the walls, arranged in order of seniority, with the novices and younger monks perhaps in a less prominent position. At one end, often on a slightly raised seat or dais, sits the abbot, the spiritual father and ultimate authority of the community. His presence commands a deep, attentive silence. The proceedings of this daily meeting, known as the capitulum or chapter, are a cornerstone of Benedictine life. A mainstream historical fact being that this assembly was absolutely vital for monastic governance. Spiritual instruction and maintaining communal discipline. During this gathering, a specific chapter of the Rule of Saint Benedict, that all-encompassing guide to your existence, I would typically be read aloud, ensuring that its precepts remained fresh and central in everyone's mind. This was followed, often, by a reading from the necrology, a somber recitation of the names of deceased brothers of that particular monastery, or from associated houses, whose anniversaries of death fell on that day, prompting a prayer for their souls. Then, the abbot would usually deliver a homily, a sermon, or some form of spiritual instruction, perhaps commenting on the portion of the rule that was read, or addressing a particular spiritual need he perceived within the community. His voice, calm yet authoritative, fills the space, each word carefully chosen. And then comes a part of the chapter meeting that might make a modern office worker slightly uncomfortable, the chapter of faults. This was a time for monks to voluntarily, and publicly, confess any minor breaches of the rule they had committed, perhaps succumbing to a moment of idle chatter when silence was prescribed, feeling a flash of anger towards a brother, or even heaven forfend, nodding off during one of the longer readings at vigils, a sin many a weary monk probably wrestled with. Sometimes, a brother might even be accused by another. Though this was meant to be done charitably and for the good of the soul, it was a bit like a medieval open mic night for minor monastic misdemeanors, though with significantly less laughter and considerably more introspective sobriety, for a particularly vivid, quirky tidbit in some monasteries, and for more significant or repeated faults that were brought to light during the chapter of faults. The offending monk might be required to perform a rather dramatic and no doubt deeply humbling public act of penance. This could involve prostrating himself full length on the cold stone floor before the abbot and the entire assembled community, remaining there in that position of utter humility until the abbot, after a suitable period of reflection and perhaps some stern words, gave him permission to rise. One that would certainly make you think twice about sneaking an extra spoonful of honey at supper. The tone of these confessions was meant to be one of genuine contrition and a desire for amendment, contributing to the overall spiritual health and discipline of the community. Historians of monasticism and scholars of the Benedictine tradition often discuss the complex dynamic within the medieval chapter meeting, particularly the delicate balance struck between the abbot's clearly defined ultimate authority as meticulously outlined in the Rule of Saint Benedict, and the actual extent to which genuine communal deliberation, open discussion, or even respectfully voiced dissent from ordinary monks regarding practical matters of monastery management or discipline might have been permitted or genuinely influential in the often challenging context of the 10th century. Was it truly a consultative body where all voices were heard, or predominantly a top-down directive from a divinely appointed leader? The reality likely varied significantly from one abbot and one community to another. Finally, after the spiritual nourishment and the communal soul-searching, comes the practical matter of the day's work. The labora part of ora et labora, pray and work. The abbot, or perhaps the prior, his second in command, or the cellarer, the monk in charge of provisions and practical affairs, would then assign the various tasks for the day. And the range of chores in a largely self-sufficient 10th century monastery was vast. Some monks, perhaps the stronger or more robust, would be dispatched to the fields for plowing, sowing, weeding, or harvesting. Depending on the season, others might be assigned to tend the livestock, the cows, sheep, pigs, or chickens that provided vital sustenance. The more learned or artistically inclined might find themselves in the scriptorium, that quiet, focused hub of intellectual labor, meticulously copying precious manuscripts, mixing inks and pigments, or perhaps even delicately illuminating a sacred text with gold leaf and vibrant colors if your monastery was wealthy enough. Then there were duties in the kitchen, endless vegetable chopping and pot scrubbing, the infirmary tending to sick or elderly brothers, the guest house offering hospitality to travelers, a key Benedictine virtue, or engaging in essential crafts like masonry, carpentry, blacksmithing, brewing the monastery's ale, or baking the daily bread. Brother Anselm, the abbot, might intone, his gaze sweeping across the assembled monks. You will be assisting Brother Infirmarian with the application of poultices today. Consider it a profound opportunity for cultivating compassion and perhaps learning to identify some rather interesting fungal infections. Brother Remigius, your exquisite calligraphy is required for the new antiphonary. You are assigned to the scriptorium. Try not to make the dragon in the initial cue look quite so cheerfully malevolent this time. The assignments are given, received with a nod of obedience, at least outwardly. Internal grumbling about being assigned rethatching the pigsty roof again was probably a private matter between you and your conscience. The chapter meeting concludes. The spiritual and organizational framework for the day is now firmly in place. You and your brothers disperse, each heading towards your appointed task, ready to engage with the world of physical work, your hands and minds now consecrated for the labor ahead. Another vital part of your rhythmic, ordered, and deeply purposeful Benedictine day. And so, with your particular chore for this substantial portion of the morning, now clearly assigned by the abbot or his delegate, perhaps you find yourself in the relative quiet and intense focus of the scriptorium, your fingers already cramping slightly as you meticulously copy out. Letter by painstaking letter, a particularly dense and beast passage from St. Augustine, using a freshly sharpened quill on a valuable sheet of vellum, or maybe you're out in the monastery sprawling. Sun-drenched vegetable patch, your back already beginning to ache. Engaged in a rather heroic and seemingly endless battle against an army of surprisingly resilient and deeply unrepentant weeds. Wherever you are, whatever your task, the first major work period of your deeply purposeful, rigorously structured Benedictine day is now well and truly underway. The sun, now climbing noticeably higher in the vast French sky, has likely burned off the last vestiges of the morning chill, and a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm of dedicated toil, be it intellectual or physical, has settled over the entire monastic community. But just as you're really getting into the particular groove of your labor, Just as the ink is finally flowing smoothly from your pen, or the rhythmic swing of your hoe is finding its most efficient cadence against the stubborn earth. Another familiar sound gently, yet insistently, pierces the air, another bell. Less strident and demanding perhaps than the great sognum that first woke you from your slumbers in the dead of night. But equally unambiguous in its summons, it's the call to the office of terce. This is the third hour of the day, typically falling around what we would consider 9 a.m. It's one of the little hours, a shorter service designed to punctuate the day with prayer, to re-sanctify your work, and to remind you, amidst the sweat and effort, of the ultimate purpose of your existence here. It's like the 10th century monastic equivalent of a mandatory spiritual coffee break. Minus, of course, the actual coffee, the sugary donuts, and any idle water cooler gossip, but with a significantly higher psalm content and a much greater emphasis on eternal salvation. The moment the bell for terce sounds, all activity across the monastery is meant to cease, or at least pause gracefully. It's rather like a medieval flash mob, but exclusively for prayer, and everyone, thankfully, already knows the sacred choreography and the ancient lyrics. Depending on the monastery's size, layout, and specific customs, you might all troop back to the main church for terce, or perhaps gather in a smaller, more conveniently located oratory or chapel for a particularly practical, quirky tidbit for those monks whose assigned work took them far from the main monastery church or cloister buildings. Perhaps they were tending sheep in distant pastures, felling timber in the woods, or working at a remote grange farm. The observance of the little hours like terce might often have been done in loco, right there on the spot. You would simply pause your labor, perhaps lay down your axe or your shepherd's crook, turn to face the east towards Jerusalem and the rising sun, and then, with your fellow field-bound brothers, you would recite the required psalms, hymns, and prayers from memory, or from a small, battered, portable psalter if you were one of the literate monks fortunate enough to possess such a treasure. It was an adaptation of the solemnity of the formal office to the rustic, earthy reality of your working surroundings, a little patch of sacred time carved out amidst the mud and toil. The office of terce itself follows a familiar, comforting pattern, similar in structure to prime and the other little hours. There will be a hymn, often one invoking the Holy Spirit. This is because a key mainstream historical fact associated with terce is that this third hour is traditionally and profoundly linked in Christian liturgical tradition with the dramatic descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles at Pentecost. As described in the Acts of the Apostles, therefore, the prayers and hymns at terce frequently, and quite appropriately, invoked the Holy Spirit, asking for divine guidance, wisdom, and strength to be poured out upon the community as they engaged in their day's work. So, you're essentially asking for a bit of divine inspiration to help you get those turnips hoed straight, or to prevent you from making a catastrophic error in the particularly complex genealogy you're copying in that manuscript. Following the hymn, you recite 3 psalms. These are often from the series known as the gradual psalms. Psalms 119-133 in the Vulgate numbering, which you'd be using, or, as with prime, further sections of the very long Psalm 118-119, which, with its 176 verses, was a gift that just kept on giving throughout the monastic week. You chant them together. The familiar Latin words a steady rhythm against the backdrop of your morning's labor. Then comes the capitulum, the little chapter, a short, potent verse or two from Scripture, followed by a short responsory, and then the Kyrie eleison and the Paternoster. You're hoping, especially if you're out in the fields under a climbing sun and your back is already protesting, that the abbot chose some of the shorter psalms for today's terce selection. Please, not the entirety of Psalm 118 verses 81 through 104 today. You might silently pray, "My spiritual fortitude is strong, but this manure isn't going to spread itself, and my vertebrae are starting to form a small, rebellious committee. The office concludes with a collect, a final prayer specific to the day or the season, gathering up all the intentions of the community. And then it's over. A brief, focused return to the divine, a spiritual reset button pressed in the midst of the morning's often strenuous and demanding toil. Monastic historians and liturgists occasionally discuss the degree of flexibility versus strict, unyielding uniformity in the actual observance of these little hours like terce, particularly in smaller, more isolated, or perhaps less wealthy monasteries, especially during intensely busy agricultural periods such as planting season or the crucial weeks of harvest. Was every single monk always able to stop their work precisely on the bell, regardless of the urgency of the task at hand? Or were there sometimes pragmatic accommodations made? Perhaps a slightly delayed or abbreviated recitation. And how might any such variations have impacted the monk's individual and communal sense of the unbroken rhythm of the Opus Dei? The work of God, for now. Though, the bell for the end of terce sounds, or the abbot gives a subtle signal. You make the sign of the cross, murmur a final Amen, and the brief respite is done. There's a moment of quiet shuffling as you and your brothers prepare to return to your labors. Your mind's hopefully a little more focused, your spirits a little refreshed, or at least reconsecrated. The inkwells in the scriptorium are reopened. The hoes in the field are picked up once more. The day's work continues, blessed and punctuated by these regular calls to prayer, each one a small anchor in the steady, predictable, and deeply soothing rhythm of your 10th century Benedictine existence. That brief. Holy pause of terce now complete. Its psalms and prayers like a refreshing sip of cool water for your working soul. You and your brothers in Christ return, with renewed, or at least dutifully re-sanctified, purpose to the various tasks that fill the bustling heart of your 10th century Benedictine morning. The sun is climbing noticeably higher now, its rays beginning to hold a genuine warmth. And the monastery, which has already been astir with the structured cadences of prayer for many, many hours, now hums with a different kind of focused devotion, the devotion of labra, the sacred, indispensable duty of work, for in the world you inhabit, this ordered microcosm of spiritual striving. Idleness is not just frowned upon as a minor character flaw, it is, according to the very rule of Saint Benedict that governs your every waking, and indeed, most of your sleeping moments. Unequivocally the enemy of the soul, and so, with that rather stark admonition echoing in your mind, you turn your hands, your mind, and your spirit to the particular toil that awaits, seeking in its steady rhythms and tangible outcomes a different kind of tranquility. A robust prayer offered not just in whispered Latin words, but in honest sweat, focused concentration, and diligent, uncomplaining effort. The variety of work undertaken within the walls of a largely self-sufficient 10th century Benedictine monastery is truly astounding, a testament to the community's resilience and ingenuity. This isn't just about prayer, it's about survival, about service, and about building a sustainable community dedicated to God. A cornerstone of this philosophy is found in chapter 48 of the Rule of Saint Benedict, which famously and unequivocally states, "Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the brothers should be occupied at certain times in manual labor, and again at fixed hours in sacred reading Lectio Divina." This simple, yet profound, directive established manual labor as a crucial, non-negotiable, and inherently dignified part of Benedictine monastic life, intended for all monks, regardless of their prior social standing or intellectual gifts, promoting humility, fostering self-sufficiency, and keeping those dangerous idle hands well and truly busy. It's the original work-life balance, though heavily weighted towards the work and pray side of the scale, with life being mostly about achieving salvation. So, What might your particular labora be on this fine, sun-drenched morning in the French countryside if you are one of the more robust brothers? Strong of back and limb, you might find yourself out in the monastery's sprawling fields, engaged in the timeless, earthy tasks of agriculture. Depending on the season, this could mean guiding a heavy wooden plow pulled by a pair of placid, slow-moving oxen, their breath misting in the cooler air of early spring as you break the stubborn winter soil. Or perhaps you're sowing precious grain from a leather pouch slung across your shoulder, carefully scattering the seeds with a practiced flick of the wrist. Later in the year, it would be the endless, back-bending work of weeding under a hot summer sun, or the communal effort of harvesting ripe wheat with sharp sickles. The air filled with the scent of cut stalks and the cheerful, if somewhat strained, camaraderie of shared toil. You might be tending the monastery's vineyard, carefully pruning the vines, or later, gathering the precious grapes. Or perhaps you're in the orchard, checking on the apples, pears, or plums, or tending to the all-important beehives, those providers of sweet honey and essential beeswax for the church candles. It's honest work, connecting you directly to the land, to the seasons, and to the fundamental miracle of growth. A younger monk, new to the life, might be gently reminded by a weathered older brother that contemplative manure spreading, when offered with the right spirit, is indeed a deeply holy and meritorious act, ranking right up there with perfectly intoning a complex antiphon. If your talents lie elsewhere, or if your physical strength is less suited to heavy fieldwork, your labora might take place within the cloister walls or the various workshops. The scriptorium, which we'll delve into more deeply later, is a place of intense, focused labor for those with neat handwriting and a good eye for detail, meticulously copying and preserving ancient texts. But there are many other crafts essential to the monastery's functioning. You might be a carpenter, shaping wood with adze, saw and plane to repair buildings, make simple furniture, or craft new tool handles. Or a stonemason, carefully dressing stone for a new section of the cloister wall or a repair to the church. Perhaps you're the blacksmith, the clang of your hammer on hot iron a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant chanting. Forging and repairing tools, hinges, and vital ironwork. You might be assigned to the mill, grinding the community's grain into flour, or to the bakehouse, kneading dough and tending the hot ovens that produce the daily bread. Its warm, comforting aroma, a blessing to the entire monastery. Or the brewhouse, where the monastery's ale, often a safer drink than local water, is carefully crafted. There's leatherworking for sandals and bookbindings, weaving for rough cloth, and countless other tasks that keep this intricate, self-contained world turning. It's like a medieval, off-grid sustainable prepper community, but with significantly more Gregorian chant and considerably fewer elaborate conspiracy theories about the outside world. Even the care of the tools themselves was a serious matter, a reflection of the Benedictine respect for order and stewardship. For a fascinating and rather telling quirky tidbit, the rule of Saint Benedict is actually quite specific and rather strict about the proper care and handling of all tools and implements used for labor. Monks were explicitly instructed to treat the monastery's tools, whether it be a hoe, a chisel, or a scribe's precious pen, with the same deep reverence and careful respect as they would the sacred vessels used upon the altar. The monk in charge of the tools, often the cellarer or a specifically designated toolkeeper, was personally responsible for their upkeep, for ensuring they were all meticulously cleaned, properly stored, and accounted for at the end of each working day. Losing a valuable iron hoe through carelessness was probably a significantly bigger deal, and would invite a more severe penance than merely losing your place in the psalter during choir. The spiritual dimension of this labora is paramount. It's not just about getting the work done, it's about how and why it's done. It's an opportunity to practice obedience doing the task assigned. Whether you like it or not, humility, no task is beneath a true monk. and mindfulness being fully present in the work of your hands. The rhythmic nature of many of these tasks, hoeing, sweeping, grinding, sanding, could become a kind of moving meditation, a prayer in action, and, of course, it kept you out of trouble. Saint Benedict knew that idle hands and an unoccupied mind were fertile ground for temptation and discontent. Naturally, the exact proportion of a monk's day spent in physical labor versus prayer or study has been a subject of much thought. Economic historians and dedicated monastic scholars continue to analyze and debate the precise balance and the historical evolution of manual labor in relation to intellectual and spiritual pursuits like prolonged scriptural study, private meditation, and the intricate art of manuscript copying within Benedictine monasteries, particularly through the often turbulent early Middle Ages, as some monasteries grew significantly wealthier, acquiring more extensive lands or perhaps more serfs, lay brothers, or oblates to perform the heaviest agricultural work. Did the original Benedictine emphasis on daily, strenuous physical toil for all choir monks gradually diminish? And if so, how might this shift have affected the lived experience and the original spirit of the rule? For now, though in your 10th century French monastery, the call to labor is clear and present. You wipe the sweat from your brow, or perhaps carefully blot an errant speck of ink from your parchment, and continue your work with diligence. There's a simple, honest satisfaction in it, a sense of contributing to the well-being of your community, a feeling of connection to the generations of monks who have performed these same tasks before you, and there's a unique tranquility to be found in this toil, a quiet peace that comes from purposeful effort, offered up as yet another note in the long, soothing, and deeply rhythmic song of your Benedictine day. That long, soothing, and deeply rhythmic song of your 10th century Benedictine day. Its verses meticulously marked by the canonical hours of prayer, and its earnest choruses by diligent, often quite strenuous, labor, now approaches its midday crescendo, or perhaps, more accurately, its midday caesura, a pause for spiritual breath and physical replenishment. The sun is likely high overhead now, perhaps beating down with a surprising intensity if it's the height of a French summer. Its warmth a welcome change from the pre-dawn chill, but also a source of growing weariness if you've been toiling in the fields. Or if it's a bleaker, colder season, that midday sun might merely be offering a pale, watery encouragement through a skein of gray clouds. Your stomach, certainly, after several uninterrupted hours of focused toil in the dusty scriptorium or rather more strenuous effort wrestling with the stubborn clay of the monastery's vegetable gardens, is probably beginning to make its own quiet, insistent, rumbling petition for some form of sustenance, and right on cue, as if perfectly attuned to those internal biological pleas, and indeed, it is. For this too is part of the rule's immaculate timing, the familiar. Expected sound of another bell chimes with measured grace through the monastery precincts. It signals the arrival of the 6th hour, the office of sext, and, not long after its conclusion, the blessed, eagerly anticipated promise of the day's main, if characteristically simple and unadorned, communal meal. You lay down your tools, whether it be a heavy hoe, a delicate quill, or a carpenter's chisel, a quick splash of water at a trough or basin to remove the worst of the field's grime, or the scriptorium's ink stains. And then it's back to the church, or perhaps a smaller oratory, for the brief but significant office of sext, like prime and terce. Sext is one of the little hours, designed to re-sanctify the day and provide a moment of spiritual refocus. The 6th hour, midday, holds particular significance in Christian tradition, often being associated with the time of Christ's crucifixion. Thus, the prayers and psalms at sext might carry a contemplative tone, perhaps reflecting on perseverance in the face of trial, or seeking strength to overcome the noonday devil, that insidious medieval concept of acedia, a kind of spiritual sloth, weariness, or listlessness that could easily afflict a soul, especially in the heat and toil of midday. It's your spiritual defense against suddenly feeling an overwhelming urge to just lie down in a sunny spot in the cloister garth and pretend to be a contemplative lizard for the rest of the afternoon. The office follows its familiar pattern, a hymn. 3 psalms chanted with your brothers. A short scriptural chapter. A responsory. And the concluding prayers, it's a brief anchor. A moment to still the body and mind after the morning's exertions. Before you turn your attention to the needs of the flesh. As sex concludes, there's a new kind of quiet anticipation in the air. It's time for refection. You file, once again in that orderly, silent procession, towards the refectory, the communal dining hall. This is often a long, high-ceilinged room, perhaps with stone walls and a timbered roof, set with long, bare wooden tables and simple backless benches. The light here might be a little softer, filtering through windows that perhaps overlook the cloister garden, one of the most defining characteristics of a Benedictine meal. And a mainstream historical fact central to monastic discipline is that, according to Chapter 38 of the Rule of Saint Benedict, meals were generally to be taken in absolute silence by the monks, while one designated brother read aloud from a sacred text. This practice, known as table reading, was intended to provide spiritual nourishment along with physical sustenance, to elevate the mind even while the body was being fed. And, quite practically, to prevent idle, distracting, or potentially contentious chatter during this important communal time. It's like a very serious, very holy audiobook experience, but with considerably more pressure to look attentive, and a distinct lack of rewind buttons if you mentally drifted off during a particularly dry passage about the more obscure Desert Fathers. So, you take your assigned place at the table. The food, served by designated Kitchener monks, is simple, seasonal, and usually, though not always, vegetarian. In the 10th century, the Benedictine diet was generally quite austere. You might have a pottage, a thick, hearty soup or stew made with vegetables from the monastery garden leeks. Onions, cabbage, turnips, beans, and perhaps some grains. Alongside this, there would almost certainly be bread, the staple of life. Likely a dark, dense, whole grain variety baked in the monastery's own ovens. Depending on the season and the monastery's resources, there might be some cheese, perhaps some fruit like apples or pears, or a handful of nuts, wine, often diluted with water, or a weak ale brewed on site, was generally permitted in moderation, as Saint Benedict, with his characteristic blend of strictness and pragmatism, allowed for it, though he urged temperance. Meat, especially red meat from 4-legged animals, was usually restricted for healthy monks, typically reserved for the sick in the infirmary or for very important feast days. Your excitement for the midday meal, therefore, might be tempered by the knowledge that it's probably another thrilling installment of Mystery Vegetable Pottage, edition 47, but hunger, after a morning's hard labor, is an excellent sauce. And how do you ask for something if you're all eating in profound silence? Well, that brings us to a rather delightful, quirky tidbit to maintain the prescribed silence during meals. Monks in many Benedictine houses often developed a surprisingly sophisticated, if somewhat limited, system of simple hand signals to request common items from the servers or from their immediate neighbors. For example, rubbing your thumb and forefinger together might indicate a need for salt. Making a circular motion with a finger on the table could be a request for more bread, or perhaps pointing to your cup and then to the water jug. It was like a secret, very subdued, monastic sign language. A carefully choreographed ballet of hands, ensuring that all needs could be met without a single word disturbing the sacred reading or the contemplative atmosphere. Remember, Brother Drogo. The prior might have reminded a clumsy novice, The signal for more ale is a gentle tilt of the imaginary cup, not an elaborate mime of wrestling a wineskin. We have decorum here. And besides, Brother Server is easily startled. The quality and quantity of food is a topic of some interest. Food historians and monastic scholars continue to analyze available evidence. From account books, archaeological remains, and interpretations of the rule itself, regarding the actual daily caloric intake and overall nutritional adequacy of the average Benedictine monk's diet in periods like the 10th century. While the rule prescribed moderation and often emphasized vegetarian fare, the practical interpretation and day-to-day application of these dietary guidelines, especially concerning the consumption of fish often permitted might fowl, or the varied products from the monastery's own farms and gardens, likely varied considerably based on geographical region, the specific season of the year, the individual monastery's wealth and landholdings, and perhaps even the particular abbot's personal interpretation of sufficiency as you eat your simple, nourishing meal. The voice of the reader drones on, perhaps recounting the inspiring life of a saint, or expounding upon a passage from Scripture. You chew slowly, thoughtfully, or perhaps just very, very hungrily. The silence around you broken only by the reader's voice, the soft clink of wooden bowls or simple earthenware, and the occasional discreet cough. It's a world away from a boisterous modern family dinner. When the meal is finished, a short prayer of thanksgiving is offered, and then you file out, again in silence, leaving the refectory to be cleaned by the assigned brothers. The main meal of the day is over, your body refueled, your spirit hopefully also a little nourished by the sacred words. Now, a different kind of quiet awaits, the period of Lectio Divina, or perhaps a brief. Permitted rest before the afternoon's labors begin anew, with the last morsel of simple, wholesome, and perhaps slightly monotonous bread consumed, and the final, murmured prayer of thanksgiving still hovering in the air of the now emptying refectory. A different kind of quiet, a more personal and introspective stillness, descends upon your 10th century Benedictine monastery. The immediate physical hunger has been attended to, the communal discipline of the silent meal dutifully observed. Now, the rule of your sainted founder, Saint Benedict, in its profound and practical wisdom regarding the necessary rhythms of both body and soul, offers a precious interlude for a different kind of nourishment, or alternatively, for some, a deeply necessary physical respite. This is the designated time for Lectio Divina, the slow, contemplative, sacred reading that feeds the spirit and illuminates the mind. Or particularly during the sweltering heat of a French summer. Or for the older, more frail brothers. Or those simply weary from a morning of particularly strenuous labor. It is a permitted, and no doubt profoundly cherished, period of brief, silent rest. Before the afternoon's round of work begins once more, inevitably and inexorably, anew, let's imagine, for a moment, that you are one of the brothers for whom Lectio Divina is prescribed this afternoon. This isn't like quickly scanning a news website or speed reading a novel for its plot. Oh no, it's a far deeper, slower, more meditative engagement with a sacred text. It's a cornerstone of Benedictine spirituality, a mainstream historical fact being that Chapter 48 of the Rule of Saint Benedict explicitly prescribes set hours each day for this sacred reading Lectio Divina, emphasizing its vital importance for the monk's spiritual growth, understanding, and intimate communion with God. Furthermore, demonstrating a keen understanding of human needs. Chapter 41 of the rule mentions that after the midday meal, particularly in the summer months, the monks may rest in their beds in silence, provided, of course, that they do not disturb any brother who might wish to use that time for reading. So, you have options, or rather, your abbot has options for you. If it is Lectio for you, you might find a quiet spot, perhaps in the sun-dappled arcades of the cloister. Seated on a stone bench, the warmth of the early afternoon sun, a gentle comfort on your back. Or, if your monastery has a designated library or armarium book cupboard, you might respectfully take a precious manuscript from its keeping. For a practical, quirky tidbit that underscores the value of these items, since manuscripts in the 10th century were incredibly precious. Laboriously handwritten on expensive vellum, and often large and unwieldy. Monks practicing Lectio Divina might not always have had a personal, portable copy of the scriptures. They might read from a single, large volume placed on a lectern in the cloister or the library. And to mark their place without ever dreaming of damaging the vellum, no folding down corners or using a sticky note here, they might employ small, intricately woven bookmarks, slender, unadorned strips of spare parchment, or even just a strategically placed and very clean finger. Actually, dog-earing a page of a sacred text would have been a bibliophilic cardinal sin, probably resulting in a very stern talking to from the librarian monk, who was often as fierce a guardian of his books as a dragon of its hoard. The process of Lectio Divina itself is traditionally described as having 4 stages, a kind of spiritual ladder. First comes Lectio the slow, attentive reading of a short passage from the Bible, perhaps a psalm you chanted earlier, or a section from the Gospels, or the writings of one of the Church Fathers. You read it not for information, but for savoring, for letting the words resonate deep within you. Then comes meditatio. Meditation. You ponder the words you have read, you chew on them. Metaphorically speaking, turning them over in your mind, asking what they mean for you, for your life, for your relationship with God. It's a bit like trying to decipher a particularly dense legal document, but with considerably more potential for genuine divine insight and definitely fewer billable hours involved. The third step is oratio, prayer. Your meditation naturally flows into a heartfelt conversation with God, a response to what you have read and pondered. It might be a prayer of praise, of thanksgiving, of petition, or of contrition. And finally, if grace allows, you might arrive at contemplatio, contemplation. This is a silent, wordless resting in the presence of God, a simple, loving awareness, a gift of union that transcends thought and feeling. Though, let's be honest, for many a weary monk, that 4th stage occasionally, and quite accidentally, segued into a 5th, unwritten stage known colloquially as dormitio, falling gently, and perhaps quite blissfully, asleep, with the sacred text resting peacefully on one's lap. If discovered, one could always claim it was a particularly deep state of mystical absorption. Of course, the exact experience of this profound practice is a point of thoughtful reflection for those who study monastic life. Monastic scholars and historians of Christian spirituality continue to explore the nuanced, lived experience of Lectio Divina for the average. Ordinary 10th century monk, how consistently and with what depth of understanding was this sophisticated 4-stage process? Lectio, meditatio, oratio. Contemplatio actually understood and practically implemented by all members of the community, and given the often limited individual literacy beyond basic Latin reading skills for some monks, and the undeniable scarcity of readily accessible personal copies of texts. How profoundly and frequently could the more esoteric contemplatio stage truly be reached by all? Or was it, for many, a more aspirational ideal, a guiding star rather than a daily arrival point? Alternatively, this period after the midday meal might be your permitted time for rest. You would retire to the dormitory, that same vast, cool space where you awoke in the pre-dawn blackness. Now, however, it might be filled with a softer, more diffused light from the high windows. You would lie down on your straw pallet, perhaps loosening your belt, and simply rest in silence. No scrolling through your phone, no catching up on emails, no listening to a podcast, just pure, unadulterated. 10th century quiet. The sounds would be muted, the distant. Rhythmic clang from the blacksmith's forge, the gentle hum of bees in the cloister garden, the soft. Even breathing of your brothers also taking their repose. It's not necessarily deep sleep you're aiming for, but a quietening of the body. A gentle release of the morning's accumulated fatigue. The abbot's own permitted brief rest was probably timed by how quickly he managed to nod off during his personal Lectio Divina session. A practical, if unofficial, monastery-wide indicator, whether spent in the deep, prayerful engagement of Lectio Divina or in the simple, restorative quiet of a midday nap. This period is a vital pause in the day's relentless rhythm. It's a time for the soul to breathe, for the body to recover. A quiet interlude of peace and inwardness, before the bell for the office of nun sounds, signaling the transition into the afternoon's labors and the slow, gentle descent of the day towards evening. That precious, quiet interlude of sacred reading or much-needed, deeply appreciated rest. A calm, reflective pool in the otherwise steadily flowing river of your rigorously structured Benedictine day eventually yields, as all things must within this ordered existence, to the inexorable, divinely ordained rhythm of the monastic timetable. Whether your mind was soaring with the profound insights of the mystics during your Lectio Divina, or your weary body was gratefully sinking ever deeper into the lumpy, yet somehow comforting, embrace of your straw-filled palate, the world outside your immediate inner focus has continued its slow, majestic turn. The sun, that great celestial timekeeper, has definitely passed its zenith now. It's beginning its gentle descent towards the western horizon, and the shadows cast by the arches in the cloister garth are beginning to lengthen, ever so slightly, painting stripes of cool darkness across the sun-warmed stone. You've likely resumed your assigned afternoon labor, perhaps more meticulous copying in the scriptorium, your eyes straining a little in the afternoon light, or maybe some lighter, though no less important. Work in the monastery's extensive gardens, the workshops, or tending to the ever-present needs of the community, and just as you fully settle back into that familiar, steady groove of purposeful toil, a bell, its tone clear and resonant in the warm afternoon air, chimes out once more across the monastic compound. It is the unmistakable call to the office of nun, the sacred duty of the mid-afternoon. This is the 9th hour of the day, which, in the somewhat fluid timekeeping of the 10th century before the tyranny of precise minutes and seconds, would generally fall around 3 p.m. Once again, tools are laid down, books are carefully closed, perhaps with a slender strip of vellum to mark your place. And conversations, if any were permitted in your particular workspace, cease. You and your brothers make your way, with that now deeply ingrained sense of unhurried, yet punctual, obedience, towards the church or the designated oratory for this next brief pause in the day's sacred tapestry. The mood of the afternoon, you might notice, is different from the fresh energy of prime or the midday weariness before sext. Now, there's perhaps a touch of serene accomplishment from the day's work so far, mixed with a gentle anticipation of the evening offices and the eventual, blessed release of Compline and the grand silence. You're starting to see the finish line of the working day, even if that finish line is, predictably, more prayer, followed by a light supper consisting primarily of, well, probably more bread and some rather interesting, if unidentifiable, vegetable matter. The office of nun holds a particularly solemn significance, a key mainstream historical fact being that this 9th hour is traditionally considered in Christian liturgical practice to be the very hour of Christ's death on the cross. This association often lends a deeply contemplative, sometimes even a slightly penitential, tone to its prayers and readings. While it also serves as a significant spiritual marker in the latter part of the ordinary working day, it's a moment to reflect on sacrifice, on redemption, and on the fleeting nature of earthly life. Before you resume your own, hopefully less dramatic, worldly tasks, like its sibling little hours of terce and sext, the office of nun is relatively brief, designed not to overly disrupt the flow of essential work, but to ensure that the entire day, from its dark beginning to its eventual close, is punctuated and sanctified by communal prayer. You gather with your brothers, the familiar scent of old stone and lingering incense a constant backdrop. The office typically begins with a hymn, perhaps one reflecting on the passion of Christ or the virtues of perseverance. Then follow the customary 3 psalms, chanted in that timeless, unadorned Gregorian style that has echoed through these monastic halls for generations. For a rather thoughtful, quirky tidbit, some monastic commentators and liturgists have associated the office of nun, occurring as it does when physical energy might naturally be waning from the day's accumulated work and the potential soporific effects of the afternoon heat. With the idea of spiritual perseverance and unwavering trust, the psalms chosen for nun might sometimes specifically reflect themes of calling upon God for strength during times of weariness, acknowledging human frailty, or reaffirming faith in divine providence, thereby serving as a kind of spiritual pick-me-up or a moment of renewed commitment before the final stretch of labor leading up to the more significant evening service of Vespers. After the Psalms, there is the short capitulum, the brief scriptural reading, followed by its responsory, then the Kyrie eleison, the Paternoster, and the concluding collect, which might again invoke God's blessing on the community's endeavors and pray for a peaceful and holy end to the day. The sheer ability of you and your brothers to seamlessly switch from, say, the earthy practicalities of mucking out the cow buyer or the intense intellectual focus of deciphering a complex Latin sentence, to a state of devout, focused prayer at the bell's first call, and then back again to your labor with equal dedication, is a testament to the deep conditioning and profound spiritual discipline that underpins this entire way of life. It's like a 10th century version of a highly trained modern professional effortlessly juggling multiple urgent emails, a crucial conference call, and then attempting to find 5 minutes for a mindful meditation app. Though your version is arguably more successful and involves significantly less existential angst about Wi-Fi connectivity, the overall impact of these frequent, yet relatively short, prayer interruptions on the monk's daily work is an interesting point of consideration. Historians of monastic work, labor practices, and even medieval spirituality sometimes consider the practical and psychological effects of these regular, albeit brief, liturgical interruptions to sustained manual or intellectual labor, such as the pauses for terce, sext, and nun. Did these frequent breaks truly enhance overall spiritual focus, renew physical energy, and refresh the monks for their ongoing tasks? As was undoubtedly intended by the holistic wisdom of the rule of Saint Benedict, or could they, in certain circumstances, particularly for tasks requiring very deep, unbroken concentration like complex manuscript illumination or intricate philosophical argumentation, have inadvertently fragmented focus and made sustained, highly productive deep work a little more challenging to achieve? It's a gentle scholarly debate, weighing the spiritual benefits against the potential practical inefficiencies. For you, brother monk, however, it is simply the rhythm of life, as natural and unquestioned as breathing, as the office of nun concludes with its final blessing, and you make the sign of the cross. There's a sense that the bulk of the day's labor is now behind you. The sun is noticeably lower, the quality of light softer, more golden. The air might carry the first faint, tantalizing hints of supper preparations beginning in the distant kitchen. Perhaps the smell of baking bread again, or the earthy aroma of root vegetables simmering. You feel the day visibly waning, drawing towards its peaceful, prayerful close, with body and soul once more reconsecrated. You and your brothers disperse for the final period of work before the arrival of Vespers, signals the true beginning of the evening. By now, some of those more complex Latin phrases you were chanting in the Psalms might, if you're not particularly careful and your stomach is particularly empty, start sounding suspiciously like imaginative recipes for turnip and parsnip stew. Did that versicle just mention a pinch of oregano, you might fleetingly wonder? Or am I just profoundly, deeply, ready for Vespers and whatever culinary delights follow, that gentle, almost subconscious? Anticipation of Vespers in the simple, if predictably unexciting. Culinary delights that might follow the day's final period of communal labor does little to diminish the focused, unwavering dedication you now bring to your assigned afternoon task. Perhaps, for you, brother scribe in the making, or perhaps brother already quite accomplished but still, deeply humble penman. This particular span of labora doesn't involve the earthy, sun-baked realities of the monastery fields or the rhythmic, noisy clang of the distant blacksmith's forge. Instead, your allocated duty unfolds within the intense, almost reverent, and profoundly focused quiet of the monastery's scriptorium. Here, amidst the faint, distinctive, and not entirely unpleasant aroma of freshly mixed iron gall ink, smoothed animal parchment, old wood, and perhaps a hint of the beeswax used for polishing book covers. Another kind of vital, world-preserving work unfolds a labor of the mind, the eye, and the incredibly patient hand that preserves the very words. The sacred texts and ancient wisdom that shape your spiritual world and, indeed, much of the intellectual heritage of centuries to come. This is the meticulous, painstaking, and, in its repetitive precision, profoundly sleepy art of the preserved word. The scriptorium itself is likely a dedicated, well-lit room. If well-lit in the 10th century can be understood as having a few more, or slightly larger, deeply splayed windows than, say, the root cellar. It might be situated near the library if your monastery is grand enough to have a separate library room, or perhaps adjacent to the church. Often on an upper floor to maximize that precious, elusive natural light and minimize dampness. You would be working at a sloping wooden desk or a carrel, designed to hold the large, heavy codex of the exemplar, the master copy you are painstakingly transcribing, and the fresh, prepared sheets of parchment or vellum onto which you are transferring its wisdom. The silence in the scriptorium is usually absolute, or as close to it as a community of living. Breathing human beings can achieve. The only sounds are the almost imperceptible rustle of parchment as pages are turned, the occasional discreet clearing of a throat, and, most persistently, the soft, rhythmic, almost hypnotic scratch. Scratch. Scratch of quill pens diligently moving across the textured surface of the animal skin. It's the original ASMR, really. A soundtrack for deep concentration and the slow, methodical birth of a new book. The process of creating a manuscript in this era was, as a mainstream historical fact, an incredibly labor-intensive, time-consuming, and remarkably costly endeavor during the early Middle Ages, and certainly in the 10th century. Monastic scriptoria, such as those found within Benedictine communities, were absolutely crucial, irreplaceable centers for the preservation and painstaking transmission of knowledge. Scribes, like yourself, would meticulously copy by hand not just biblical scriptures and essential liturgical books, but also the voluminous writings of the Church Fathers. Classical Latin texts from authors like Virgil or Cicero, if your abbot was broad-minded enough. Historical chronicles, and scientific or medical treatises that had survived the collapse of the Roman world. Each finished manuscript was an individual work of art, a significant investment of resources, and a precious treasure. Ensuring the survival of these vital words through periods of widespread illiteracy. social upheaval, and the general precariousness of existence. Downloading a large file on a dial-up modem back in the day had nothing on the sheer time and effort it took to download a single copy of. Say, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy onto vellum. Progress was measured in individual, perfectly formed letters per hour, with occasional buffering due to a blunt quill or a moment of profound, eye-straining weariness. Your tools are simple, yet require great skill to master. Your quill pen, likely fashioned from a goose or swan feather, has been carefully cut and sharpened by your own hand to achieve the desired thickness of stroke. Your ink, a deep black or rich brown, is probably made from oak galls and iron salts, or perhaps from soot. Mixed with a binder like gum arabic, each monastery might have its own cherished recipe. Before you even begin to write, the parchment sheet, a precious piece of treated calfskin or sheepskin, has been smoothed with pumice and meticulously ruled with a lead stylus or a blind awl to create feint. Invisible guidelines for your script, ensuring your lines of text are straight and evenly spaced. Absolute precision is the aim. You are not just copying words, you are honoring them, preserving them with the utmost care and reverence. You probably develop a very close, personal, and occasionally deeply adversarial relationship with a particularly stubborn letter S that some days simply refuses to be formed with the requisite calligraphic elegance. No matter how many times you practice it on a scrap piece of parchment, if you are also an illuminator, or if that task is assigned to another brother with particular artistic talents. Then after the main text is copied, the manuscript might be further adorned with vibrant, jewel-like pigments, rich blues from lapis lazuli if the monastery could afford such an expensive import, bright reds from vermilion or minium, greens from malachite, and, of course, the shimmering splendor of gold leaf, carefully applied to initial letters, borders, or even full-page miniature paintings. This was not just decoration, it was an act of devotion, making the sacred word visibly beautiful, a feast for the eyes as well as the soul. And sometimes, the scribes themselves left their own tiny marks. For a truly delightful and humanizing quirky tidbit scribes at the very end of a long and arduous manuscript they had just finished copying would sometimes add personal notes, known as colophons. These weren't part of the original text, but little additions by the copyist. They could express immense relief at finally completing the monumental task. Complain humorously about the cold conditions in the scriptorium or the poor quality of the candlelight. Ask for a prayer from the future reader of the book, or even, quite playfully, lay down a curse upon anyone who might dare to steal or in any way damage the precious, newly created volume. A typical colophon might read something like, "This book is now finished. May the scribe who wrote it rest his weary hand in peace, and may a large skin of good wine be given to him as a just reward." It's a wonderful reminder of the individual human effort behind these seemingly impersonal ancient texts. The degree of artistic freedom versus strict adherence to the master copy is an area of gentle scholarly inquiry. Art historians and paleographers, those experts who study ancient handwriting and manuscripts, continue to analyze the subtle nuances within these hand-copied texts. Debating the precise degree of individual artistic license versus the expected strict adherence to established exemplars, the master copies from which scribes worked in the output of monastic illuminators, rubricators those who added the red titles and headings, and even the main text scribes during the 10th century, while general calligraphic styles and iconographic conventions were certainly followed. How much room was there for subtle personal interpretation, minor regional variations in letter forms, or even the occasional playful, almost hidden, deviation in the intricate decorative elements of a manuscript? As the afternoon light begins to slant further, and your eyes grow tired from the intense focus, you carefully blot your last line. Perhaps clean your quill, and prepare to put away your precious materials. The scriptorium's work is slow, it is demanding, it is often anonymous, but it is also profoundly satisfying. You are a guardian of words, a preserver of ideas, a vital link in a long chain of knowledge stretching back into the mists of antiquity and forward into a future you will never see. Each perfectly formed letter, each carefully copied phrase, is a small victory against the encroaching darkness of ignorance, a tiny beacon of light and learning, tended with devout patience, as the bell for Vespers begins to call you, and your weary eyes. Back to the choir, that clear, insistent call of the Vespers bell, echoing with a mellow, sonorous tone through the now noticeably cooler air of the late afternoon, is a sound that resonates deep within your monastic soul, a familiar punctuation mark signaling a profound shift in the day's ancient rhythm. Your eyes, perhaps indeed weary and a little strained from the hours spent deciphering minuscule, densely packed script in the relative dimness of the scriptorium, or from the long, sun-drenched, and often dusty vistas of the monastery fields. Now turn once more, with a sense of ingrained duty and perhaps a touch of quiet anticipation, towards the hallowed sanctuary of the church. The main bulk of the day's labora, the strenuous physical and demanding intellectual toil, is now largely, blessedly, done. A different kind of work, the sacred, melodic song of the approaching evening, now awaits your voice and your heart. This is the office of Vespers, one of the twin great pillars of your daily round of prayer. A solemn, often deeply beautiful, and richly textured farewell to the rapidly fading light, and a prayerful, contemplative welcome to the softly encroaching, star-dusted night. As you and your brothers gather once more in the choir stalls, the atmosphere within the great stone church has subtly transformed. The brighter light of midday and early afternoon has now softened, replaced by the longer, gentler, more golden rays of the declining sun slanting through the high western windows, perhaps painting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ancient stone floor and the carved wooden stalls. As the service progresses and dusk truly begins to settle, more candles will be lit, their warm, flickering glow creating pools of light in the growing darkness, pushing back the shadows but also deepening their mystery. There's a sense of completion in the air, a collective winding down from the day's outward activities, and a turning inward towards reflection and thanksgiving. It's a bit like that distinct Friday afternoon feeling at the end of a long work week. A sense of tasks accomplished and a quieter period ahead. But, in your case, with considerably more Gregorian chant and significantly less immediate prospect of a relaxing weekend, binge-watching illuminated manuscripts, Vespers, or evening prayer, holds a place of profound significance in your Benedictine life. It is, as a mainstream historical fact, one of the two principal hinge hours of the divine office, the other being Lauds morning prayer. Traditionally celebrated as daylight is visibly fading. Typically around the time of sunset, Vespers is a major and often musically rich liturgical service, always distinguished by the solemn and joyful chanting of the Magnificat, the canticle of the Blessed Virgin Mary, as recorded in the Gospel of Luke. It's a cornerstone of the daily prayer cycle, a moment when the entire community comes together to offer thanks for the day that has passed and to seek God's protection through the coming night. The office begins, as always, with the opening versicles and responses, Deus in adjutorium meum intende. You chant, O God, come to my assistance. And your brothers respond, Domine, ad adjuvandum me festina. O Lord, make haste to help me. Then follow the psalms, usually 5 of them, each with its proper antiphon sung before and after. These Vespers psalms are often drawn from the latter part of the Psalter, typically Psalms 109 to 147 in the Vulgate numbering you use. And their themes can vary, but often include motifs of thanksgiving, trust in God's providence, the remembrance of salvation history, and prayers for peace and protection. The chanting is measured, sonorous, the familiar Latin words flowing like a well-worn river through the sacred space. After the Psalms, there is a short scriptural reading, the capitulum, followed by a short responsory and then a beautiful evening hymn, one perhaps speaking of Christ as the light of the world, or giving thanks for the day's blessings. And then comes the crowning jewel of Vespers, the Magnificat, as the first notes of its special antiphon are intoned. There's often a subtle shift in posture, perhaps a deeper sense of reverence. All stand as the great canticle begins, Magnificat anima mea Dominum. My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Saviour. This powerful, exultant song of Mary, praising God for his mercy and his mighty deeds, is a central expression of evening praise. You hope, with a quiet, internal prayer, that Brother Cantor is in particularly good voice tonight, as a well-sung Magnificat can truly lift the spirit, whereas a slightly off-key or hesitant rendition can sometimes make the very angels in the carvings overhead appear to wince. Ever so politely, of course. The lighting of candles or oil lamps specifically for the office of Vespers often carried deep symbolic weight. A rather lovely quirky tidbit being that this act wasn't merely for practical illumination as darkness fell, but also represented Christ as the true lux mundi, the light of the world, whose presence dispels the spiritual darkness. In some more elaborate monastic traditions, there might have even been a small, dignified ritual procession or a specific, beautiful chant associated with the solemn bringing of light into the darkening church as Vespers began, adding a touch of quiet. Visual drama to the transition from day to night. The flickering flames dance, casting moving shadows, making the familiar saints in the murals or stained glass if your 10th century church is fortunate enough to have such as seem to almost breathe in the dim. Holy light. You might even smell the faint, sweet aroma of incense if it's a particularly important feast day, its fragrant smoke curling upwards, symbolizing your prayers ascending to heaven. Following the Magnificat, there are the preces, or intercessions, where prayers are offered for the church, for the world, for rulers, for the sick, for travelers, for the departed, and for the specific needs of your own community. Then comes the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, recited by all, and the concluding collect, or prayer, for the day, offered by the abbot or the officiating monk. The musical richness of Vespers is often a point of discussion for scholars. Liturgical musicologists and dedicated historians of the Benedictine rite continue to explore the fascinating evolution of musical elaboration, specifically for the office of Vespers throughout the early Middle Ages. While 10th century practice was likely characterized by a greater degree of melodic austerity when compared to the complex polyphonic developments of later centuries, there is ongoing scholarly discussion and research into the potential degree of melodic richness that might have existed. The possible use of unwritten traditional tropes or improvised ornamental notes in the psalmody, or, most particularly, in the chanting of the Magnificat, and the extent to which these musical expressions might have varied between major, influential monastic centers like Cluny and more modest, smaller monastic houses with fewer resources or less formally trained cantors. As the final Amen of Vespers resounds and then gently fades into the evening stillness, a profound sense of peace often settles over you and your brothers. The day, in a spiritual and liturgical sense, is now truly complete. The sun has set. The world outside the monastery walls is surrendering tonight. You have offered your evening sacrifice of praise? Your stomach, by this point, might be composing its own rather plaintive chant in eager anticipation of the light supper, or collation. That is soon to come. My soul doth indeed magnify the Lord. You might think with a touch of very human anticipation, and my stomach doth acutely magnify the need for perhaps a small blessed piece of cheese, or even just a slightly thicker slice of that good. honest bread. If it pleases his divine providence, the sacred and the mundane, ever intertwined in the life of a monk, that beautiful, resonant Amen of Vespers, marking the sun's final, glorious farewell and the spiritual closing of the day's main devotional and physical work, still hangs almost palpably in the cool, incense-kissed evening air of the ancient church. Your stomach, which was perhaps performing its own quiet, understated plain song of eager anticipation during the latter psalms of the evening office, now feels a little thrill of acknowledgement. Not, of course, a thrill of wild, unrestrained feasting. For that is most emphatically not the Benedictine way, but rather the quiet satisfaction found in the prospect of simple, humble sustenance offered at the evening collation. This is the light evening meal, or sometimes just a fortifying drink, a gentle, thoughtful punctuation mark before the final prayers of Compline usher in the profound, unbroken silence of the monastic night. You and your brothers file, with that familiar, practiced order, from the church, perhaps back to the refectory where you took your main midday meal, or sometimes, depending on the monastery's size and custom, to a smaller, less formal room set aside for this more modest repast. The light is very dim now, perhaps a few tallow candles or oil lamps cast a soft, flickering glow on the long wooden tables, creating an atmosphere of deep calm and introspection. The day's heat has entirely dissipated, and the evening air, drifting in through any open archways of the cloister, carries the scent of damp earth, night-blooming flowers if the season is right, and the profound, all-encompassing peace of the countryside settling into darkness. It's a world away from the boisterous inns or smoky hearths of any nearby village. Here, all is quiet, ordered, and focused on the gentle winding down of another day spent in God's service. The collation itself is typically characterized by its extreme simplicity, a far cry from even your earlier, already quite frugal, midday meal. This is less of a full supper and more of what you might call a polite, almost apologetic, suggestion of sustenance, the term collation itself. And this is a delightful mainstream historical fact. Actually derives from the common monastic practice of listening to readings from the Collationis Patrum and Scetica Remo, which translates as the Conferences of the Desert Fathers by the 4th or 5th century monk John Cassian. During or immediately after this light evening repast, these readings, full of wisdom from the early Christian ascetics, were intended to provide spiritual food and prepare the monks' minds for a peaceful and holy night's rest. So, you're getting nourishment for both body and soul, though the body's portion is, shall we say, often on the minimalist side, the rule of Saint Benedict. In chapter 42 indeed implies a light repast or at least a drink before the final office of Compline, especially after the prescribed evening reading. What might this collation consist of in your 10th century French monastery? Very likely. It would be a piece of bread, that ever-present, life-sustaining staple, perhaps a slightly smaller portion than you received at midday. Alongside it, you might have a cup of water, or perhaps some well-diluted wine or the thinnest of monastery-brewed ale. If the monastery's gardens were productive and the season allowed, there might be a piece of fruit, a crisp apple in autumn, a few berries in summer, or perhaps a small serving of whatever cooked vegetables were left over from the main meal. Served cold, it was not designed to be filling, but rather to stave off any distracting hunger pangs during the night, or the very early morning hours before the community broke its fast after prime or terce the next day. It was the original light bite before bed, but with significantly more spiritual gravitas and absolutely zero chance of late-night snacking raids on the pantry. Silence, as at the main meal, is usually strictly observed during collation. The voice of the designated reader, continuing with Cassian's conferences or perhaps another edifying spiritual text, fills the quiet space of the refectory. You listen, or at least you try to listen, while you slowly consume your meager fare, It's like a very serious, deeply contemplative bedtime story, specifically designed to induce pious thoughts and a sense of calm, rather than any overly exciting or adventurous dreams. Though, after a particularly long day of, say, hauling stones for a new wall, some of Cassian's more complex arguments about the eight principal vices might just very gently lull your weary mind into a state of serene, almost theological, drowsiness. And there were, of course, rules. For a rather practical, quirky tidbit, strict monastic regulations often govern the end of the day in a community, including a clear prohibition on taking any food or drink whatsoever from the refectory back to the common dormitory after collation or, most certainly, after Compline. This was partly to discourage any form of private hoarding or individual indulgence, thereby ensuring communal discipline and equality in austerity. But it also likely served a very practical purpose to prevent unwelcome issues with mice, rats, or other inquisitive vermin in the sleeping quarters, which, given the rustic nature of 10th century construction, were probably already quite adept at finding their way into places they weren't invited. A stray crumb could be an open invitation to a nocturnal feast for unwanted guests. The precise nature of this evening's sustenance is, naturally, a point of some consideration for those who study the past. Dietary historians and monastic archaeologists sometimes engage in detailed debate regarding the specific composition and actual caloric value of the typical monastic collation in different 10th century Benedictine houses and across the various seasons of the liturgical year. Was it consistently just a symbolic piece of dry bread and a single cup of water or thin wine for every monk? Or did it, in some instances, particularly in wealthier monasteries or on certain lesser feast days, include more substantial items like a small portion of cooked vegetables, a morsel of cheese, or a few pieces of dried fruit, and more broadly, how did this very light evening meal truly suffice to sustain the community, especially those monks who had engaged in demanding physical labor throughout the long afternoon? Until their next proper meal many hours later, once collation is finished, and the reader concludes, there's a period of quiet activity as the monastery prepares for its final communal act of the day, the office of Compline. You might have a few moments for personal reflection, perhaps to silently review your day. Considering your actions in light of the rule, some monks might use this time for mending their worn habits or simple leather sandals by the dim, flickering light of a carefully hoarded candle stub. Others might quietly review the text for the next day's offices, or simply sit in the growing stillness of the cloister, absorbing the peace of the encroaching night. Your nighttime routine, as you might imagine, is a masterclass in simplicity, perhaps a quick wash of the face and hands with more icy water from a basin, a silent recitation of a few favorite psalms under your breath as you make your way towards the church, and a concerted effort, once you finally reach your pallet, not to snore so loudly that you wake Brotherlin no Tanari no, the monk next to you. Glamorous, it is not, but it is ordered, it is peaceful, and it is drawing you ever closer to the profound, restorative silence of the great sleep just after one final, beautiful offering of prayer. That quiet, contemplative interlude after your meager yet somehow satisfying collation. A precious hushed time perhaps spent mending the ever-present wear on your rough-spun woolen habit by the dimmest of lights. Or perhaps just mending the tired fabric of your own thoughts with some silent, personal prayer. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, draws to its inevitable, peaceful close. The last vestiges of even the deepest twilight have long since surrendered to the full, encompassing, and often rather chilly, darkness of a 10th century French night. A profound, almost tangible stillness has settled over the entire monastery complex. A silence broken only by the distant, mournful hoot of an owl from the nearby woods, or perhaps the gentle, rhythmic sigh of the night wind as it whispers through the ancient roof timbers of the church and dormitory, and then a final, soft bell, its tone perhaps a little more gentle, more like a lullaby than a summons, or maybe just a quiet. Verbal summons passed from a senior monk, calls you and your brethren one last time this day to the familiar, hallowed space of the church. This is it, the office of Compline, the day's final, collective offering of peace, the beautiful, gentle, and deeply comforting prayer that, in essence, tucks the entire monastic community into God's loving keeping for the long. Dark hours of the night, you gather in the choir, the darkness now almost complete, relieved only by a few carefully tended candles or oil lamps that cast long, flickering, dancing shadows on the cold stone walls and pillars. The air is cool and still, heavy with the scent of snuffed beeswax from earlier services and the faint, lingering aroma of ancient incense. There's a unique atmosphere to Compline, a sense of profound intimacy and shared vulnerability as you and your brothers stand on the very threshold of night and sleep. The day, with all its prayers, its labors, its small triumphs and minor frustrations, is now truly behind you. This is the final act, the completion. Indeed, a mainstream historical fact is that the very name Compline is derived from the Latin word completorium, meaning completion. As it is the liturgical office that completes the monk's daily cycle of prayer, it is a prayer service recited just before retiring to bed, universally characterized by its themes of seeking divine protection through the night, achieving interior peace, and making a reflective examination of the day just past. Crucially, it is immediately followed by the strict observance of the grand silence, which lasts undisturbed until the office of prime the next morning. The service itself is beautifully structured to evoke peace and trust. It often begins with a brief reading, perhaps an exhortation to sobriety and vigilance, followed by a communal confession of sins, the confiteor, where you humbly acknowledge your failings and shortcomings of the day before God and your brothers, seeking pardon and peace. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. You might murmur, striking your breast gently, a quiet admission of shared human frailty in the enveloping darkness. Then come the Psalms, typically just a few, short, and carefully chosen for their appropriateness to the end of the day. Psalm 4 with its plea, In pace in adipsum, dormiam et requiescam. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, is a classic Compline psalm. Psalm 90 or 91 in some numberings. Qui habitat in adjutorio altissimi. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, with its powerful imagery of dwelling under God's protective wings, is another profound source of comfort. And often Psalm 133 or 134. Exe nunc benedicite Dominum. Behold now, bless ye the Lord, all ye servants of the Lord. A beautiful call for those who keep watch in the house of the Lord by night to offer their praise. The chanting is soft, subdued, more like a gentle lullaby than the more robust singing of vespers or lauds, following the psalms and their antiphons. There is another short reading, and then the deeply moving short responsory. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. You repeat this phrase, a profound act of surrender and trust, echoing Christ's own last words from the cross, and then, like a beautiful, peaceful sigh at the day's end, comes the Canticle of Simeon, the Nunc Dimittis, from the Gospel of Luke. Nunc dimittis servum tuum, Domine, secundum verbum tuum in pace. Now, Master, you may let your servant go in peace, according to your word. There's a profound sense of relief, of a day's work well done, of readiness for rest in these words. It's the ultimate mic drop of the liturgical day, the serene relief of finally being allowed to go to bed after a very, very long and demanding shift. Prayers are then offered for a peaceful night, for protection from all harm, from bad dreams, and from the snares of the enemy, and for a particularly charming and tangible quirky tidbit, a common and deeply beloved custom in many Benedictine monasteries, often occurring immediately after the formal prayers of Compline were concluded, was for the abbot, or another senior monk specifically designated for this task, to walk quietly through the dormitory and sometimes other key parts of the monastery, gently sprinkling everything and everyone with holy water using an aspergillum. This aspertio was seen as a tangible, physical blessing, a spiritual cleansing of the space and its inhabitants, and a potent warding off of any evil spirits, unsettling nightmares, or other unwelcome nocturnal disturbances that might seek to disrupt the monk's precious, well-earned rest. You might feel the cool, blessed droplets land softly on your face or habit as the abbot passes. A final, comforting seal on the day. The deeper meaning and psychological impact of Compline's themes are often considered by scholars. Liturgical historians and those who study the spirituality of the monastic tradition often trace the rich historical development and profound symbolism of particular elements within Compline, such as the Canticle of Simeon, the Nunc Dimittis. They discuss its intricate theological links to themes of fulfillment, peaceful departure from the day's cares and metaphorically, from life itself, and the ultimate Christian hope of seeing God's salvation. There's also careful consideration of how its consistent and deliberate placement at the very end of the daily cycle psychologically prepared the medieval monk for the state of sleep, which, in the medieval mindset, was often viewed as a small, nightly rehearsal or foreshadowing of death itself, thus imbuing the act of going to bed with a deep spiritual significance. Finally, a Marian antiphon, a prayer to the Blessed Virgin Mary, might be sung, its melody gentle and imploring. The abbot gives a concluding blessing, Noctem quietam et finem perfectum, concedit nobis Dominus omnipotens. May the Lord Almighty grant us a quiet night and a perfect end. And all respond, Amen. The candles are extinguished one by one, plunging the church into almost complete darkness. You rise, and in profound silence, the grand silence that will not be broken until after prime the next morning, you and your brothers file out of the church and make your way slowly, thoughtfully, back to the cold, familiar embrace of the dormitory. After Compline, the only officially approved sound in the entire monastery is, one might gently jest, the almost inaudible rustle of angels' wings checking in on the sleeping saints. Or possibly, just possibly, Brother Infirmarian's impressively resonant and surprisingly rhythmic snoring, which some of the younger monks secretly claim has minor, localized healing properties for insomnia. But for you, all that matters now is the promise of your straw pallet and the deep, dreamless peace of a day lived fully, and now, perfectly, completed. That final, whispered Amen of Compline, a gentle benediction still echoing softly in the deepest recesses of your mind, has now truly signaled the day's end. You find yourself back once more in the vast, cold and profoundly, almost primordially, dark expanse of the communal dormitory, the long day, with its intricate, unvarying tapestry of chanted prayer and diligent labor, its fleeting moments of individual toil and its brief, cherished snatches of sanctioned rest, has been perfectly, liturgically, and exhaustively completed. And as you carefully lie down on your simple, straw-filled pallet, perhaps adjusting its lumpy contours for the 100th time to find that elusive spot of minimal discomfort, and pull the single rough woolen blanket up to your chin, the entire monastery around you, every ancient stone, every shadowy archway, every sleeping soul, now collectively enters into the deepest, most sacred, and most strictly observed quiet of all the Magnum Silentium, the grand silence. This is not merely an absence of noise, it is a presence, an unbroken, serene ocean of profound stillness that will stretch undisturbed all the way through the remaining hours of the night until the first faint stirrings for vigils, or perhaps even the office of prime, herald the arrival of a brand new, and remarkably similar, day. This period of grand silence, or magnum silentium in Latin, is a fundamental and very strictly enforced observance in the Benedictine tradition, as indeed it is in many other ancient monastic orders. It officially commences immediately after the conclusion of Compline and Lass, unbroken by any unnecessary speech, until a designated point after the first liturgical office of the following day, typically after prime or sometimes lauds. This extended, sacrosanct period of quiet was, and is, considered absolutely essential for fostering deep interior prayer, allowing for undisturbed contemplation, ensuring adequate physical rest for the community, and maintaining the overall spiritual discipline, profound peace, and sacred atmosphere of the monastery. It is the ultimate do not disturb sign, hung upon the very soul of the community. The loudest sound you are likely to hear during these hours might be your own stomach, gently rumbling a forgotten psalm in its sleep. Or perhaps, if you're unlucky enough to be near him, the abbot having a particularly vivid and doctrinally complex dream about the correct interpretation of a disputed passage in a letter from a rival bishop, resulting in a few sleepy, theological pronouncements. You lie there in the darkness, a still, anonymous shape beneath your blanket, surrounded by the quiet, rhythmic breathing of your many brothers. The air in the dormitory is cold, still carrying that faint, familiar scent of old wood, beeswax, and the collective, earthy aroma of sleeping humanity. There are no flickering candles now, no oil lamps left burning. The darkness is almost absolute, a velvety blackness that encourages the eyes to close and the mind to turn inward, or preferably, to simply switch off. This is a time for the soul to commune with God in the deepest stillness, or for the body to finally, gratefully, succumb to the profound weariness accumulated over a day that began for you some 16 or 17 hours ago, in a similar, if perhaps even colder, darkness. It's the ultimate digital detox. 10th century style, far more effective and with significantly fewer initial withdrawal symptoms, mostly because there was precious little to digitally withdraw from, except perhaps the urge to discuss. In hushed tones, the slightly suspicious texture of the turnips at the midday meal. The silence is not empty, it is full, full of unspoken prayers, full of the quiet presence of your community, full of the anticipated peace of God. It is a protective barrier, a sacred enclosure not just of stone walls, but of shared intention and disciplined quiet. And this discipline was taken very seriously. For a rather telling quirky tidbit, while the grand silence was indeed paramount and rigorously observed, it is understood that extremely minimal and absolutely essential communication, if utterly unavoidable at ease, for instance, by the dedicated infirmarian tending to a suddenly very sick or dying monk in the night, or perhaps the guest master discreetly guiding a genuinely distressed and unexpected late-night traveler who had arrived at the monastery gates in dire need, might have been permitted. However, such communication would have been conducted using the most abbreviated of whispers, or even, where possible, through a pre-established system of very simple, almost imperceptible hand gestures, all to avoid disturbing the profound, enveloping quiet that held the sleeping community in its sacred embrace. Even these rare exceptions would have been undertaken with the utmost caution and brevity. The peace of the night was a treasure to be guarded. The profound nature of this enforced quiet naturally invites contemplation on its effects. Historians of monastic culture, and indeed scholars of contemplative traditions and even psychologists, continue to explore the nuanced psychological and spiritual effects of such prolonged, communally enforced silence on the individual medieval monk. While clearly intended by the rule of St. Benedict and subsequent monastic legislators to foster deep interiority, facilitate uninterrupted prayer, and promote profound peace. How was this great silence subjectively experienced by each individual within that communal setting? Was it consistently a profound spiritual aid and a welcome? Restorative rest for all? Or did it, perhaps for certain temperaments or during particularly stressful periods within the monastery or the wider world, occasionally lead to feelings of heightened isolation, an unwelcome amplification of anxious thoughts, or even a challenging confrontation with one's own inner turmoil within the otherwise supportive context of the monastic brotherhood? The silence, like a mirror, could reflect back whatever the soul held. For you, however, on this particular night, after a day lived in faithful adherence to the rule, the grand silence is most likely a welcome friend, a gentle mother. It is the final, soft cadence in the long, daily symphony of prayer and work. You feel the weariness in your limbs, a dull ache in your back perhaps from the fields or the scriptorium, but it's an honest weariness, born of good labor done for God and community. Your mind, though perhaps still faintly echoing with the day's chants or the words of the evening reading, is slowly, gratefully, letting go. You might offer a final, silent prayer, a simple commendation of your soul to God's keeping, as you did aloud with your brothers at Compline. And then you sleep, a deep, usually dreamless, and profoundly necessary sleep, sheltered within the strong, silent walls of your Benedictine monastery, here in the heart of 10th century France. The world outside, with its own chaotic rhythms, its feudal struggles, its famines, and its fleeting joys, fades into utter insignificance. Here, within this sacred enclosure, there is only the profound peace of the grand silence, the quiet breathing of your brothers, and the gentle, unseen embrace of the long monastic night, holding you safe until the bell for vigils, many hours hence, will once again call you forth to begin the timeless, soothing and deeply purposeful cycle all over again,